Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Wallet Max Planet Positive podcast. I'm Bhuva Shakti, based in New York, and the founder of Wallet Max. We are a global community of startups, investors, and executives focused on increasing sustainable funding access, especially in climate tech, fintech, deep tech, and AI sectors. We interview one investor every month for our podcast. We invite them to share their background, but more importantly, what differentiates them from the crowd. How do they prioritize profits, impact, and people? We deep dive into their personal and professional journeys and their mission to uplift. Today, we are speaking with Rene Baston, a venture partner at Covenant Venture Capital, an alternative asset management firm. Rene has more than 25 years' experience in venture creation, innovation, life sciences, digital health, healthcare, clean tech, nanotech, and data science. Rene also has an extensive executive network and strategic alliance experience with Fortune 500 and startup companies in the US and internationally. Previously, Rene was the VP of Strategy and a member of the ideation team at Team 8 Health, a digital health startup foundry focused on building and scaling transformative healthcare companies. Let me now hand over to Rene and invite him to say a few words about his background and career path. Over to you, Rene.
Hi, Bhuva. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always exciting to do podcasts with other folks. I have a small podcast myself, and it's always nice to sit on the other side, not only doing it with you, who I enjoy your company and our conversations, but also because it gives you kind of the sense of what your interviewees are facing when they do this type of thing. So thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. And so, what was the question again? A little bit about myself. I'm so thrilled to be here. I
Yeah.
forgot your question.
No, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to have you also. It's always nice to be on the other side. But today I would like to learn more about your professional journey, your career path. How did you get where you are today?
Absolutely. Happy to talk about it. When I was at the New York Academy of Sciences, we used to have a set of events for PhD students across different science areas called What Can I Be with a PhD? And I used to go out there and read from Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. And the first reaction of everybody when they sat into the room and I started reading the poem was, "We're in the wrong room." And then I explained that I said, "Hold on, just bear with me." And the whole idea was where the poem gets onto way leads on to way. And I took the path less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So that's kind of what my background is like. I had twists and turns that were directionally correct. So I started off in natural intelligence. Artificial intelligence is all the rage now. But I started off in a
Yeah.
neurobiology lab studying learning and memory and thinking that that's what I was going to do. I was going to get my doctorate in that space. Then I started to notice a few things. First off, I already had the entrepreneurial bent. And I said, I want to do something entrepreneurial. At the time, you couldn't really talk about to the head of the lab about doing anything entrepreneurial, particularly on this side of it. It wasn't tech, it was life
Mhm.
sciences, right? And
Yeah.
the thought that you wouldn't go into academia was a big deal. And so we didn't really talk about that. Eventually, I started to see, MD PhDs in our lab who were doing their first postdoc after having spent an enormous number of years in school, particularly if you're an MD PhD. And looking at even from this lab, which is a very prominent lab in neurobiology, they were looking at potentially another 2 or 3 postdocs before they can even think about having their own lab. And I thought, okay, this is intellectually extraordinarily stimulating. But from a lifestyle perspective, it wasn't really where I envisioned myself being.
Mhm.
I had been doing a lot of computational work in the lab. I had set up our first automated sequencing facility. And I discovered that Columbia had just created a Department of Biomedical Informatics. And that really excited me. And I jumped over to the Department of Biomedical Informatics and got my degree there. So what do people typically do with biomedical informatics? They go to a hospital, they become, the chief medical innovation officer or information officer, or something in that IT hierarchy, or they go to a company and they do that sort of thing. My path was going to the consulting side of things. Ernst& Young had a very strong healthcare IT group at the time. So I managed to join them basically by crashing a Columbia Business School MBA event. And I said, how about somebody who actually knows something about healthcare IT? And so I got hired at the event, and then I joined them, had a phenomenal experience for a number of years, learned a lot about business, and then decided to create my own startup company. So this was the first of three. Then I went in and out of Colombia after this multiple times, and I can tell you a little bit more about the startups later. I think we're going to talk about that, but went in and out of Colombia multiple times. So I like to say that Colombia is like the mob for me. I kept trying to get out, and they kept pulling me back in. So every time I tried to escape, I came back. I went there as an undergrad. I went there in grad school, and I worked there three times. The first time I went back was to the tech transfer office, now called Columbia Technology Ventures. And part of the
Yeah.
reason that I went there is after my initial startup experience, where I really knew absolutely nothing about building a startup back then. I said I wanted to understand a little bit more about intellectual property, about translational research, and these types of things. And that seemed like the perfect place to do it. So I spent a number of years there doing just that. I covered anything that was biomedical informatics, now called digital health, um,
Yeah.
anything that was biotech, nanotech, particularly with applications to biotech, those sorts of things. And then left to the New York Academy of Sciences. So I was recruited to the Academy, but what really sparked my interest was the Academy is probably the oldest and largest scientific organization you may never have heard of. It was
Mm.
founded by Charles Darwin as an answer to the Royal Society, which he believed was too elitist. It was typically aristocratic scientists, so he wanted to democratize science, and did a
Mm.
phenomenal job. So at the time that I was there, the Academy had 30,000 scientist members around the world. It was very heavy on academia. So what they wanted me to do with the experience that I had was to bring in industry science and government lab science, and in particular with the business element around it as well. So I became their chief business officer, and part of what I did was create a consulting group that helped governments around the world figure out how to leverage science and technology to develop innovation ecosystems. And for me, that was really compelling because it was another
Yeah.
aspect of innovation, right? So I've always been interested in innovation. That was my directionally correct, right? So I hopped from a lab to biomedical informatics to a consulting firm to a nonprofit, but the path was always innovation. I like this idea of how do you make science and technology breathe from a commercial perspective, where I thought you can impact more people, right? So I did this with the governor of New York State. My colleagues and I helped to write the governor's energy plan to feed some of the information into it, the asset mapping, those types of things, the recommendations. Worked with the mayors of Mexico City and Buenos Aires, with the Minister of Innovation of India, all on areas around science and technology. A lot of it was healthcare, clean tech, alternative energy, these types of things. Um, then from there, jumped to do another startup. In this case, it was developing a point of care diagnostic that was using single walled carbon nanotubes, chips, right? And the idea behind it, uh, my first two startups tend to be 10 to 15 years too early. I just spoke literally with a startup last night that's trying to do what we were trying to do there. Um, most most point of care diagnostics, both back then and still, are colorimetric, which means you put a sample on it and it changes color. And if it changes to the
Yeah.
right color, they say you have or don't have whatever, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the challenge with that is it's not very precise, and you don't get a direct digital signal. So the promise of this was that you can get a direct digital signal and very precise data on what was going on with any given patient from a diagnostic perspective. So that's what we were doing back then. Then that startup went on for a while, and then I came back to Columbia to the Data Science Institute when it was created by Mayor Bloomberg's Applied Sciences Initiative. So I was the founding director of entrepreneurship and industry interactions there, and it was a great experience going back to Columbia. So this was back at Columbia, uh, seeing the students come in at the beginning of the year, it had been a while since I'd experienced that sense of the world is really your oyster and everything is possible, right? So that was
Everything is possible.
everything
Yeah.
is possible, right? It just so much energy, right? Really
Hmm.
infectious,
Yeah.
and it was really a great experience. I was there for a little bit over a year, and then left to do another startup. And they knew when I came in that this was part of the deal. I was trying to get their programs up and running, and then brought somebody else in to replace me. So went and did another startup. Worked at City University with their fantastic head of research at the time, Julian Small, helping them to build up their innovation ecosystem while I was doing my startup. And then wound up getting recruited back to Columbia to head up something called the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub, which for me was great because it was this kind of, crisscrossing this intersection of my academic background, my technical background, and the business background, because the goal there was to try to tackle large problems that couldn't be solved by any industry sector, by any sector alone, whether it's industry, academia, nonprofits, government, et cetera, and to bring all of those actors together to try to create solutions and then disseminate those solutions. So a lot of what we did was on the academia side, but a lot of it was also on the commercial side, right? What are things that you can build that can be commercialized that have an impact on problems in healthcare, problems in smart communities, which includes alternative energy, smart city technology, smart community technologies in education and in science itself. And there were overlays of this that are, I think, still very important today. So things like responsible data science and AI. So everything had that kind of lens to it, and that was a great experience. Did that for 4 years. Got the a fair amount of funding for the organization, including the renewal funding from the National Science Foundation, and then got recruited to a really phenomenal place called Team 8. So Team 8 is
Yeah.
a venture studio, and for those who don't know what a venture studio is, it's an organization that doesn't invest in other people's startups. It decides what needs to be built in any given domain, and it has a team of people who know how to build it over and over again in that domain, right? So I can tell you later about how we were structured if that's interesting. But the the point of this was they were by the time I left, $1.5 billion AUM venture studio with a quite high exit rate of their startups. They started off in cybersecurity, then they built a fintech venture studio, and then digital health. And I joined them a little bit before the digital health, knowing that it was coming. And I was helping out at this kind of intersection between science and entrepreneurship. Did a lot of work with some of our LPs, like the George Kaiser Family Foundation, to help build some of what they were trying to do in Tulsa that was at this kind of intersection of entrepreneurship and technology. And then when it came time to build the Digital Health Venture Studio, I was part of the founding team that helped to adapt their model to healthcare, which was different, right? It was definitely different from the way that you approach both cybersecurity and fintech. So spent a number of years doing that. Really loved it. Loved the team. Loved what I was doing. Didn't love the 12 hours each way to Tel Aviv once a month with a child at home. So decided to do something closer to home. And that's when I joined Covenant. And I can tell you a little bit about Covenant. So Covenant, as you mentioned, is an alternative asset management firm, and we have a quite successful private credit fund, which doesn't suffer from any of the issues that you've heard of, with BlackRock and Blue Owl and those types of things. Ours is based on hyper diversified small business loans, and the average maturity is about 9 months, and that's been returning quite substantial returns net to investors for many, many years.
That's
Uh,
quite a short term.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's quite good because it has multiple layers of de-risking the way that that it was put together.
Mm.
We have a late stage uh, employee tender fund or series of funds, which are in companies like SpaceX and Anthropic and Anduril and OpenAI, Gecko Robotics, these types of companies. We have private placement insurance product, and then we have venture. So venture is kind of the high risk, high reward, newest asset class, and I run the venture group. Uh, Part of what distinguishes us is that we're also a qualified venture firm with the state of New Jersey. So there's an application process. There's a handful of qualified venture firms. So we're one of them, And we do a lot of work with the New Jersey Economic Development Authority and their Innovation Evergreen Fund, which allows us to get between 8 and 10 million if it's a women or minority owned business in matching funds. So the state is our LP in startups that we invest in that are either already in Jersey or moved to New Jersey. So we do a lot of work with New Jersey because of that.
Yeah, that's quite a journey, and especially also going back to Colombia multiple times, and I come from Colombia as well. You keep coming out, and then they keep pulling you back,
I mean,
and
it's
you
a great
can't
place to
stay
land,
put
right?
there.
It's a great place to land in between other things too, right?
Yeah, yeah, very good, very good. So even when you don't have anything, you can just go, and something will come up. So really great place to be. And in all your journey, innovation has been the key mission or your purpose, right? So you've also done a lot of science and technology, research labs, startups, ventures, but there is always this challenge where how do you balance the right amount of innovation with science, regulations, but end of day commercialization matters, right? So what's the right balance and how do you pick the right moment?
I mean, it's so moment is the right way to think about it because a lot of this has to do with timing and something
Yeah,
that very few people admit to. It also has to do with luck, and luck is kind of interrelated with timing, right? Now, I'm a big believer that, fortune rewards the prepared. So the trick is to be prepared to take advantage of good fortune and good timing. So
mhm,
that's part of it for sure. And I just, since you said that, I wanted to point that out because I hear very few people say I was lucky, right? Everybody wants to say how amazing they are. All right. And so I recognize that I've been very lucky in a lot of things, right? So that's one thing. The other is, it depends. It depends on if you're an investor, what your thesis is, and where your guardrails are on that thesis. So, as an example, we are broadly deep tech investors, certainly in our late stage funds and even in our early stage funds, which is what I do. I lean more into biomedical space, but even within
mhm.
the biomedical space, I tend to go more towards health tech as opposed to pure therapeutics. Now, we do look at some therapeutics if they're particularly de risked. But the challenge for us, which is something you always have to ask yourself from an innovation perspective, is therapeutics take a lot of funding and a long time, and there are very precise inflection points of risking and de-risking along the way, and you have to have the capability, the runway, the depth of funding to be able to deal with that type of risk. And for us, the
Yeah,
calculus was we like things that are at the intersection of technology and biomedicine, or just deep tech generally speaking. So what that means is it changes the regulatory risk largely. Health tech and digital pharma still have regulatory challenges that you have to deal with, but they're different in their nature, right? So
yeah.
that to us is where we like to play, and I think everybody has a different kind of calculus for how to balance that.
Yeah. Now, what I heard is deep tech quite few times. Now, there is always a challenge when you go from deep tech into a real business, right? Especially also since you come from the university background, but you've also done a lot of research and venture creation and investing. How do you really translate deep tech into a real business? What's your secret sauce? Sometimes there is a lot of misunderstood parts in technology transfer. Sometimes it becomes really difficult to really become a business, even though you have good innovation, right? So, how do you assess that?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I've seen this from multiple angles, right? I've seen it from the university technology transfer side. I've seen it as somebody who's licensed university technologies. And I'm also an instructor for the National Science Foundation Innovation Core program, which is essentially lean startup
Yeah,
instruction in typically 7-week cohorts, although there are different ranges. And the way that that works is it's all NSF funded science teams that believe that they have a startup, and so we coach them. So I've coached hundreds of teams now. I've been doing this since 2013, so I've seen it from a lot of different angles. The first thing that I'll say is if that's the way that you're doing the innovation, and that's not the only way to get to a deep tech innovation, right? But if that's the way that you're doing the innovation, the thing to keep in mind is there are lots of fantastic ideas in academia. There are a lot of ideas that are quite good for advancing knowledge for the sake of advancing knowledge. Not all of those ideas are going to be good businesses.
Yeah,
So I always look at this from an innovation perspective is there's invention and there's innovation. And the innovation part of it is what takes that invention and does something useful in the world with it. From an innovation perspective, you have, essentially two forks. There could be more in between, but for argument's sake, let's just say there are two. One is something that does something useful in the world, but is not a business, right? This could be
yeah,
through a philanthropy. So when I was doing work with in India, one of the really beautiful things that I learned there was this notion of frugal innovation, right? And there were
yeah,
all sorts of different entities in India, nonprofits, that focused on this notion of frugal innovation. One of them, for example, one of the big challenges was fires, because a lot of places in rural India still used oil lamps and cooked
yeah,
with different combustibles, right? That were not like our gas stoves in our kitchens here, right? They were not very safe. And so they said,
yeah,
particularly for light, we can create solar lanterns that are very inexpensive and get them out into the world. And what was really cool about this is they took these solar lanterns, started to, essentially place them in people's homes in rural areas. And here's where innovation really takes root and super interesting from a frugal innovation perspective. A cottage industry developed around this with locals who learned how to repair those lanterns. So you didn't have to send them back and wait weeks. And they would then charge people, some modest amount of money to fix and
yeah,
refurbish their lanterns. So now all of a sudden you've got something that's really useful, very useful from a health and safety perspective. And also people need light, at night, and they have much better light with these solar lanterns, which are rechargeable and all of that sort of thing, off grid if you need them to be. But then on top of that, the locals developed their own cottage industry, which was a measure of their innovation. They created both a little bit of technology innovation because they had to learn how to repair these things, sometimes not with the tools that you would think. And on
yeah,
top of that, a business innovation where they said, there is a demand for this, and we're going to create the supply for that demand. So that type of thing is really useful in the world. Now, from an investor perspective, when I look at innovation, I'm looking at, can you create a business around this? So when I speak to folks about what their innovation is, or when I was doing this at Team 8 where we're creating startups, the question is always, is there a real business here? Even more so than the technology behind it. So the deep tech is in the service of the business, not the other way around. And frequently when you going back full circle to academia, frequently when you're working with academics, researchers to try to get technologies out, they've worked on these technologies for so long, sometimes 20 plus years. This is their
yeah,
baby. And so it's a technology in search of a business as opposed to a business need in search of a technology to solve that need. And so when we go into that section of innovation, that's the way that I think about it. Business first. Are we solving somebody's problem? Is it a big enough problem that it's going to matter from a business perspective? And it's going to matter also from an outcomes perspective, right? And if so, then that's something that I'm interested in. And essentially, those are the types of innovation that I deal the most with now.
yeah. I mean, couldn't agree more on the frugal innovation part. It's also very much renewable energy, less pollution, circular economy. There are so many things tied into that one innovation,
It's
and it's
fascinating, right?
economically useful, right? Yeah. It's uplifting so many communities, even financially, and providing a lot of financial independence. And in terms of technology, like you rightly mentioned, we don't need a business that is required to build around a technology, because we need a business problem that needs to be solved and maybe use technology for it. So today there is so much AI hype. Every company comes and pitches AI powered, AI enabled, right? But what is the real problem? You also earlier in the week mentioned that it's about what problem are you solving, and then is technology helping, right? So that's the battle between technology searching for a business versus solving a business problem with technology. You mentioned something about lean startup that you teach that at NSF, right? So, how is lean startup methodology useful in life sciences and healthcare? How does it, accelerate the path between lab and market? I understand deep tech, but would love to hear more about life sciences and healthcare to bridging
Yeah.
the.
You know, I don't spend a lot of time going through. I don't even know what they're called on LinkedIn. Those short videos, right? Or on Instagram or whatever. I don't even know what they're called, but they pop up
Yeah,
every once
they're
in a
called
while,
the clips,
right?
reels.
Those little
I
clips.
mean, so many names.
They're yeah, and they're all over the place, and they seem like a phenomenal waste of time most of the time because people wind up just flipping through these randomly, and like a chicken clucking to get a little bit
Yeah.
of feed at a fair, right? But this one actually attracted my attention. It was Steve Jobs, and I forget what the title was, but it was enough to draw me in. And what was great about this was, and this is frequently misunderstood with Steve Jobs, where people say, no, Steve Jobs said, I don't care what customers think. I'm going to create what they
No.
need. And that's not what he
Yeah.
said. And in fact,
Yeah.
it was very lean startup. And he's going on and saying what people really misunderstand is you have to put the customer first. And it's not this old trite, the customer is always right. The idea was you need to build something that customers actually want or need. Sometimes they may not know what they want or need. And if you build that and you know, the light bulb goes off, then they'll buy it. But by and large, you have to put the customer first when you're building a business. You have to understand who your customer actually is. Number one, you have to go out and speak to those customers. I just did, well, you and I did an event together a couple of days ago, the New
Yeah.
Jersey, the Jersey City Tech Meetup event. And I was at another event this weekend where I was on a panel on innovation and startups and that sort of thing. And I spoke to a lot of startups that came up to me and said, this is what we're building. And I said, okay, so who's your target customer for that? And they tell me whatever it is. And then I said, how many of those customers have you spoken to? Two. And you already have an MVP? Yes. And that's the core idea here, which is before you build anything, understand your beachhead customer, understand the larger
Yeah.
market, but really understand your beachhead customer, what they actually need or want. Again, whether they realize it or not, part of this is observation. It's not just speaking to people and asking them questions. That's the starting point, but observing how they do what they do and where there's friction. And that's the core of this. Before you spend time, energy, and treasure building something, make sure that you're building something that somebody not only is interested in, but really needs and is willing to pay for. And that holds the same in biomedicine, right? Um, the nature of it is different, whether you're looking at clinical care or whether you're looking at pharmaceutical R&D, right? Um, the regulatory constraints are quite substantial in both, but different in nature as well. But that general
Yeah.
principle really does apply. Now, where it gets different is the biomedical ecosystem is arguably the most complex out there. So a big
Yeah.
part of what we do with Lean Startup is help the teams understand how to navigate that ecosystem. First off, how to get enough understanding of the ecosystem that you can begin to navigate it. And it's always super interesting. Every once in a while you have a team that really gets it, but most teams have really never thought this through, right? And in healthcare, think about all of the misaligned incentives that you have, where you have payers, you have brokers in between payers and, let's say, companies, right? You
Yeah.
have those payers, but you also have self-insured companies. You've got the healthcare facilities, which can be an academic medical center or a rural hospital. They have different incentives than a physician's group, which can be a large physician group that's contained in a hospital, or an independent one, which increasingly probably fewer of. There's now urgent care. All of these things have overlapping but also misaligned incentives. Same thing if you're looking at the pharma industry, although maybe a little bit less complex when it comes to this, but not necessarily, right? So you have the big pharmaceutical companies with massive war chests and distribution channels that largely depend on biotech companies, sometimes universities, to come up with new druggable targets, with new therapeutics, with new diagnostics, with new technologies that are associated with, and make these things all easier for patients to use, all of those sorts of things. You also have payers in the mix. You've got the FDA in the mix. So all of these things make really complex ecosystems. And part of what we're trying to teach here is how do you navigate, in particularly these super complex ecosystems in healthcare, to really understand how to build a business. The rest of it is, fairly similar. The business models are different because, if you're dependent on payers or Medicare or whatever, that constrains the types of business models you can have. But even there, you have things like value-based care, which is coming out, which is a different way of thinking about the value that's provided, and it's a different way of remuneration for the healthcare facilities that use it. So that creates new opportunities within that complex ecosystem.
Yeah, no, definitely agreed. And I also admire Steve Jobs. Definitely, he said that we need to create what the customer doesn't know what they want. But then, if you create something that doesn't align with customer expectations, then they're not going to use it. They're not going to pay for it, right? So, he was also a big believer of user experience and customer design, right? So, really, lean startup approach is applicable across all sectors, especially to kind of first validate that proof. And then obviously you can scale how you think. Now, moving from ideas and innovation, I want to talk a little bit about those founders, right? Because you can have the best framework, you can teach the best innovation and science and technology, regulation, commercialization, but many times it also depends on the founders. I mean, who are those founders who are different from the crowd that believes commercialization of complex science is possible? I mean, obviously, you need to validate ideas early when the science is still evolving and the market is not fully defined. Some of this is longer cycles, right? So, what is that characteristic of that founder that would be required to really translate this into a viable business model?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll talk on the characteristics of the founders first, and then we can talk about the characteristics of the business, right? But I mean, look, it's the things that you've probably already heard of, right? Which is they need to have grit, right?
Yeah,
Because it's hard. You're devoting 10 to 15 years, probably minimum, unless you're really lucky, of your life. And yes, we all hear the stories of they built that company 3 years ago and they already. In fact, we had that happen at Team 8 more than once, where one of it was encouraged for members of Team 8 to join the companies. In fact, your vesting could even be accelerated if that happened, right? So it was really encouraged. And I have a colleague who joined the company that was acquired within 2 years, right? So those things do happen, but by and large, you need to think about 10-year cycles, right? You're going to devote the next 10
hmm,
years of your life to this. And there are going to be a lot of challenges along the way, a lot of problems that need to be solved, a lot of heartache, and you need to be able to get through that. So grit is a really important one. This notion of creating, the warped reality field where you're creating, there's a famous computer scientist, K is his last name, and he said the best way of predicting the future is to create it, right? So you
yeah,
want founders who operate that way. They're going to create the future. And that, again, that doesn't mean we've been working on technology for 20 years and now we want to find a business case for it. It means they have the conviction that I really truly identified a challenge in the marketplace that they can meet, and others may not believe it, but they believe it, and they know, importantly, it's not just based on belief. They have a plan for how to get there, right? A credible plan, even if it's early stage. So obviously they have to be smart, but they also have to have a good, EQ, right? They need to work well as a team because, again,
yeah,
despite what you see in the news about, the wonderkind, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and all of these things, none of these folks are building this in isolation. They're building it with teams. And yeah, there are
yeah,
famously difficult people like Jobs and Zuckerberg and all of those types of things. But by and large,
yeah,
I tend to lean towards the founders who know how to create a team properly that shores up the things that they're weak in and that knows how to incentivize that team to get them to all row in the same direction with as little friction as possible. And there's always going to be friction, but that's a gift, right? Being able to get people to do things even when they don't want to do them, and to get everybody moving in the same direction. So those are the types of things that are really important. The other thing that I think is really important, particularly when you're dealing with technology businesses, is, and I've alluded to this more than once, there are a lot of founders out there who love their technology, and it's the hammer and nail thing, right? They have a hammer, so they're looking for a nail. They want somebody to, yeah. And if you don't understand what their technology is, the problem is you. And of course, that's the wrong approach. So typically,
Yeah.
what the founders that interest me the most, and obviously there are exceptions to this rule. Somebody has something really cool from a technology perspective, and I see where the market is, then potentially I'm interested. But by and large, I want a founder to tell me, this is the problem we're solving, this is how we're solving it. Technology comes next, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of hand wavy, particularly in deep tech, AI related things in every field. A lot of hand wavy. We're an AI company. I don't really know what that means. What I need to know is, what use case are you addressing? What problem are you solving for whom specifically? How are you doing that? And how do you make money doing that? Then I want to hear about the tools that give you some sort of a moat or some sort of an advantage in doing this in a way that delights your customer. That's the kind of the order for me. So I want founders that are business forward as opposed to technology forward. That doesn't mean I don't want founders who are crackerjack technologists. I do, or who have one on their team, but that's the priority, because I've seen too many times the other way around where, and you can even be fooled by it. I can get I'm a techie. I can get excited by a technology and then go, yeah, but there's no real business in it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, couldn't agree more on the teams, because if you try to become everything, then this is not a business. Finding those complementing team members who can work with each other, especially in early stage, it's a lot of hours, not enough revenue. So you really have to get them motivated as the leader with the EQ and the other skills that you bring in. Technology has no place in that, right? So I totally relate with that. Now, if you are able to share a venture or investment that didn't go as expected, and what it taught you about building or investing in companies, I'd love to hear that.
Sure. I mean, it's my company, my first company, and I use this when I teach lean startup for the National Science Foundation, right? Because the whole point of it is customer discovery. So I came out, with my degree in biomedical informatics. I spent a few years at Ernst and Young implementing healthcare IT systems, and working with both pharma and the clinical side. And I thought, I know what the world needs. The world needs me to bring together clinical and genomic data, and to, do analytics on top of this. And back then, machine learning was a thing, and of course, data science was a thing. It may not have been called that, but it was a thing, right? So the idea was, regardless of how you do it, it could be analytics, it could be, rules based, it could be machine learning or whatever. There's so much value in the combination of those two data sets. And I thought, this is what the world needs. What I quickly discovered, this was before the dot-com bubble, right before it, which is not the best time to start up a business. So that's another lesson there. But what I quickly discovered was, I had built something that nobody wanted at the time. Now everybody wants it, but it was, 15 years too early. And that was a really hard lesson to learn. And so that notion, when I talk about it, it's because I've lived it, right? Don't build something
Yeah.
that nobody wants. Go out and talk to your customers before you build anything. What we did discover was, mostly because one of our board members and investors was in the home medical equipment business. And so what we discovered is that that's a super fragmented business. What the hospitals wanted at the time, the healthcare facilities wanted at the time, was they were reducing costs, because, as you know, hospitals run on razor margins. And so what they were looking at was enterprise resource planning systems, supply chain management systems, all of that sort of thing that helped reduce the cost and, make a better bottom line for them. The issue was that none of those large companies that were in that space, so, JD Edwards and I2 Technologies, which we partnered with both of them eventually, they wouldn't go into this sector because it was too fragmented and it was too difficult
Mm.
for them, and they already had marquee clients that were a lot easier to get to. So our insight became a business insight, and we said, after speaking to our board members, that you guys have the technical capabilities to bring that into the non-acute healthcare space. And what we figured out was a business innovation, which was, we became value-added resellers to JD Edwards and IT Technologies, et cetera. And we bundled them and created technology on top of it specific to non-acute healthcare. And what we learned how to do was use the salespeople of existing, HMEs, home medical equipment dealerships, to sell our product. So we didn't have to spend the money on that sales force. Sometimes it was tricky to get them incentivized versus their other products, but it was working. And so, all of that was how to pivot, right? The idea of this notion of pivot, which is big and lean. The other part of it was timing. So right now, as we were talking the other day at the tech event that we were at, um, the timing is interesting, right? Because I see a lot of
Yeah,
elements of the dot-com bubble. Not to say that AI is going to disappear, just like the internet didn't disappear. Super useful,
yeah,
massive economic benefits. You're going to see the same thing, and probably more so with AI. But when you start to look at the valuations of a lot of the AI companies, they're starting to feel like frothy dot-com companies. So timing is really important, and having enough runway to get through bad times is important. So you have to weigh that against dilution and taking more money than you need and all of those types of things. But it made me more cautious for the startups that I work with, to ensure that they really understand their customer. They're only building when they understand their customers, that they're business forward, that the timing works out, because you can have somebody with a phenomenal idea where you can see how they're going to make money in 10 years, right?
in
Not
10
now.
years. Yeah.
And so all of those things were impacted by this first startup. And we started off not knowing what we were doing. We managed to do a good pivot, but the timing was terrible, and it cratered because after we got the equivalent of, I think, $4 million in today's dollars in seed investment. And after that, we couldn't get the VCs who we could check off all of the things that they said that they wanted, but it didn't matter because the dot-com bubble had burst and everybody was just retracting their funding. So all of these things are kind of underlying lessons to the way that I deal with founders today.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more with the timing. Sometimes you could be too early, but sometimes you could be little late also. Sometimes founders come and say, I have no competition, I'm the only one. But then when you dig
It's
into
all
it,
too
you'll
common,
see
right?
that. I mean, when someone says, I have zero competition, I'm like, okay, fine, this is a red flag,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, so someone might have been doing it for a long time and they didn't know, and they are like they have first mover advantage. So timing is really very important. Definitely agreed. And the valuation was bloated right after the pandemic. I was hoping it's gonna stabilize. Then the AI thing came, and now again it's bloated, right? So one
Yeah.
after another. Now, you've worked across academia, government, and private markets, right? So, what's one assumption each sector gets wrong about the others that, in your experience, everyone should come together to work on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'll start from the academia side, and the nonprofit side, actually, because this was a common theme in both. Uh, Everybody saw, and I think this has changed over time as tech transfer offices have become more sophisticated and that sort of thing. But I heard this more than once in both places. That's Johnson and Johnson. They've got unlimited funds, right? So they would get angry if they didn't do sponsored research, or if they didn't license the technology, or if they didn't provide money for an event or something like that. And what they didn't realize is, yeah, it's a large company and it's got big coffers, but all of that funding is divvied up among different departments who may have a discretionary line of income that they can spend on things. And beyond that, they have to get approval from somebody else who may not give them approval. So it was
Yeah,
really
that takes a
interesting.
lot of time.
It takes a lot of time, and you heard this a lot. And these poor folks who really actually wanted to work with you, they got such a bad rap on that side of things, because there was a misunderstanding of the way that their internal structure operated. So that's
Mm,
one thing. On the flip side, with investors, similar type of thing where folks were like, investors only want what they want, and they're here basically to cherry pick and then leave you in the lurch and all of that. And that's, part of that is a misunderstanding of the way that investors actually work, how, they have to return money to their LPs. And they're always looking from that perspective at the things that they're willing to invest in. And they have very limited time because they have to put their money to work in 10-year cycles, which really means a 5-year cycle of investment and then a 5-year cycle of maintenance and hopefully of liquidity that gets distributed. And so, there's a speed challenge there between academia and investment and business that was always a cause of friction and a cause of misunderstanding because they didn't understand how that actually works. And I think the flip side also on the science side, right? So folks on the business side always wanted things to go faster than that system was capable of producing. The way that the system operated depended on a lot of peer review, a lot of double checking before you get things out, as opposed to this notion, which I think is a little bit less so in pharmaceutical industry and clinical care, for example, but the notion of, break things fast and then move on, right? So that's hard to do in science. It's also hard to do in healthcare, generally speaking. But nonetheless, the speed is typically faster because, if you don't move fast, it impacts your bottom line. And so there was always this urgency to push academia to do things that were really beyond their capability of doing, right? Similar with government, right? There's multiple layers of bureaucracy. The last thing that a government entity wants is to wind up on the pages of the New York Times because they screwed something up. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
things move slowly, and they move slowly on purpose, right? So, all of that is, generally speaking, there are these mismatches in the underlying perception. That isn't to say that there aren't people who, maybe behave badly in certain ways on any of these fronts. But I think largely a lot of this was people didn't really understand how the other side operated. And there was a very interesting thing that Oren Herskowitz, who was the head of Columbia Technology Ventures until recently, did, where he and a group of other tech transfer offices pulled together a group of VCs to talk about, I think it was focused on engineering.
Hmm.
Let's understand each other, how we operate, and then let's come up with a set of agreements that we can use as umbrella agreements that take that into account and try to reduce some of the friction in our interactions. And I think it was quite successful. So, more of that would be good at reducing these types of misunderstandings.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with Oren also quite some time. I've been a mentor and advisor at the startups. This was a great initiative, especially all we are trying to do is how does expectation mismatch does not happen. Each one has their priorities. Where do we meet in the middle? So it's a win-win for everyone, right? It comes to basic skills versus any technology or a sophisticated framework.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting, right? Because that act of pulling people together and increasing their understanding of each other did more to reduce the friction in these transactions than anything else, any amount of money, any amount of, my technology is the best thing since sliced bread. You just don't understand. It really is. It's a great lesson in how to actually get things done, and in fact, in negotiating, right? There's still a lot of people out there. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this, coming from on high right now, in terms of negotiating by intimidation and trying to screw the other guy when you're negotiating. And the reality is that the best negotiations are the ones where people understand what the other side wants and meet
Hmm.
in the middle so that everybody gets something out of whatever you're negotiating. And this was a really great example of that.
Yeah, no, totally agreed. Totally agreed. I mean, it can only get you so far, intimidated negotiation, because end of day you might not get what you want, and you would have lost a good opportunity, or in fact, ruin the relationship, right? So relationship building is also really
Exactly. And think of
because
all
it's,
the time and effort that goes into getting through that first deal. Why wouldn't you want to maintain that relationship and do another one, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Now, for founders and professionals trying to break into deep tech or venture creation, especially if they are from a non-traditional path, what's the most practical way to get started? Do you have any tips for them?
I mean, first off, it's speak to a lot of people who are doing what you think you want to do. Again, I'll go back on that customer discovery side of things. It's really, really useful, right? And
Mm, mm.
just last night, I was at the Hit Lab event, and I was speaking to a couple of students who were working at NYU, and one was at Columbia, and they wanted to break into venture, as an example.
Mm,
And you know, there are two paths to break into venture. One is you get an MBA, you become an associate, or you become an associate and hopefully they pay for your MBA, and then you work your way up the ranks, which is fine. And
yeah.
I think there are people who have done that who are, quite good venture capitalists. But I really like the notion of going back to this idea of understanding the other side. If you want to break into that world, become an operator first, right?
Mm,
Because that gives you an understanding of the people you're funding. If you've gone through it in an early stage company, whether it's exited or not, VCs tend to prefer people who exited, but to some degree, a failed entrepreneur is an experienced entrepreneur as well, right?
yeah, yeah. A lot of lessons.
A lot of lessons. And the Kauffman Foundation, I think it was, did some research on this, and it turns out that the average number of startups that a successful founder does before they're successful is generally in the 4 to 5 range, right?
Wow.
So,
Yeah,
don't look down on the people who haven't made it yet. But there is a bias towards that, of course. But in any case,
yeah,
the notion is become an operator first. Whether you founded the company or you're an early employee or whatever, that journey really informs you and helps you understand the founders that you're investing in. Because you may have at times mismatched incentives, and that's even more important to have that understanding on the other side. And if you're a technologist or a scientist that's trying to break into this business world, same thing. Go out there and speak to a lot of folks, get an understanding of it, and then make an informed decision about how to jump. Typically for a technologist or a scientist, the route in is on that side, right? You're either doing some engineering work, you're doing some science work, some research for these companies, but go in with an idea of where you may want your path to be. You're not going to know it necessarily up front, but again, be directionally correct. If you want to get into the business side of things, start from that perspective when you negotiate your contract, right? Say, I want to do research, but I also want exposure to these types of things. And that's easier to
yeah.
do in a small startup because everybody, kind of has to do everything to some degree,
Has to do everything. Yeah, yeah.
right? So that's, I think that's where I would start.
No, I mean, a lot of people don't realize the value of an operator, but that's where you get those entrepreneurship as well as venture investing experience, right? So it's kind of the foundation. I cannot support that enough because I'm an operator as well, first and foremost, before I became an entrepreneur and an investor. So really could relate to that. And I know our time is kind of coming up. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up?
No, I mean, look, it's you hear about all of these crazy things in terms of uh, there's always the sky is falling with new technology waves, and we have that now. And I do
Yes.
think that it's important to consider these things. It's why we had a responsible AI group at the hub. I do think it's very important because certain things, if you make the mistakes up front, they're not easy to undo. That
Mm,
said, I also am a big believer. I'm an optimist, which is, another trait that entrepreneurs need to have, right? Is to be optimistic about the future.
yeah.
Otherwise, you
Yeah.
won't have that grit anymore. You'll just give
Yeah.
up. So I'm an optimist, and I do think that there's going to be disruption, as there always is when you have new technology waves. But right now, what we're seeing is there are so many things that get freed up if you know how to use these technologies properly. That there is so much opportunity for entrepreneurship. In fact, I think, and I have an 11-year-old son, and we have these conversations a lot. He's been saying he wants to be an astrophysicist for many years, but he's also very interested in entrepreneurship. And he's talking
Mm,
already about what he wants to do in college and grad school and job wise and all of that stuff. And I told him, I mean, it's great that you're thinking about it. It's going to
yeah.
change, so don't get too stuck on anything. But my
Yeah.
advice is, look, the world is changing. The workforce that you're going to go into is very different. one of the areas that I see a really bright spot in is entrepreneurship, leveraging these
Mm,
technologies. And I think this is a place where you're going to see a big blossoming because the cost of building something is coming dramatically down because of these new tools. So the
yeah.
more creative people get, the better understanding they get of how to build businesses. You're going to see all sorts of flavors, I suspect. You're going to see the things that are, these big businesses that are nationwide, global, or whatever. You're going to see some hyper local businesses that are much easier to create, whether it's taking, all of the local plumbers. I was just speaking to somebody in Jersey City about this, taking all of the home improvement shops and, you know, putting that technology overlay on them and being able to do this work more effectively at a local level. There are so many variations of these themes that I'm very optimistic. Now, one of the things that I do really care about having a child and having started off, looking at learning and memory, is the human cognitive and social impact,
Hmm.
from a development perspective, of not using these tools effectively, right?
Yeah.
So, balancing those two things, I think if we manage to balance them, there's going to be disruption and there's going to be pain, right? There are going to be people who don't make that transition, and that's, as a society, I think we need to figure out how to deal with those folks in an effective way, more effectively than we did, multiple times in the past, right? When disruptions came. But on the other side, I do have an optimism that if we manage to do it right, if we manage to put those guardrails in place, you're going to see a blossoming of all sorts of things that weren't possible before now becoming possible.
Yeah, no, definitely. Change is the only thing that's constant, but also not trying to replace people with technology or vice versa, trying to work together in an integrated fashion. You started in natural intelligence, we are in artificial intelligence at the moment, kind of finding a way to balance both and kind of live together between the two is what I'm thinking.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Renee, for taking time to chat with us today. We can keep on going forever, but we'll have to wrap up here. But thank you so much for sharing everything. I had a great conversation today.
Likewise, but it was always a pleasure having a conversation with you, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Renee. See you soon.